They say the human brain can project the voices of those we miss the most when we are lonely. But my dog heard it too. And dogs don't hallucinate grief. If you've ever lived completely alone in a house with a dark, pitch-black basement, you know the rule: you never look into the dark for too long. Because sometimes, the dark looks back, and it uses the voice of someone you buried years ago. To understand how I ended up alone in that massive, creaking house in Ohio, you have to understand my family's tragic past. When I was just 7 years old, a horrific car crash on a rainy November night changed everything. A reckless driver smashed into our family SUV. My father didn't survive the night. My mother survived, but her spine was severely damaged, leaving her permanently disabled and making it incredibly difficult for her to walk. The only thing my dad left us was that old, two-story colonial house. We had no money to move, so my mom and I stayed there. By the time I turned 11, my mom started dating a man named Richard. She began spending most of her weekends at his place in the city, leaving me behind. But I wasn't entirely alone. During those lonely weeks, my Uncle David, my dad's younger brother, would come over to babysit me. Uncle David was the closest thing I ever had to a father after the accident. He was a tall, cheerful guy who drove an old Ford truck. He'd throw a baseball with me in the backyard, help me feed our pets, and take me out for late-night burgers. He created the childhood memories that my dad never got the chance to give me, but as the years rolled by, things changed. My mom officially married Richard and moved into his upscale suburban home. I was 16, and suddenly, Uncle David stopped visiting. Months passed, then a year. Whenever I asked my mom where Uncle David went, she would get incredibly quiet, change the subject, or give vague answers like, "He's just traveling, Ethan. He needed some space." My mom was a deeply compassionate woman who hated causing pain, so I figured Uncle David had either moved out west or maybe he was dealing with some personal issues. I didn't push it. By the time I turned 19, I was legally an adult. My mom and Richard bought a new house across the state, and they basically handed the keys of the old Ohio house to me. For a 19-year-old guy, having a massive, 4-bedroom house to himself sounded like an absolute dream. And for a while, it was. I had friends over until 3 a.m., played video games on full blast, left pizza boxes all over the living room, and invited girls over without anyone knocking on my door. But when the party ended and the house went dead silent, a deep, heavy loneliness would creep in. The house felt too big, too empty. The only other living soul in that house was Buster. Buster was my Australian Shepherd. He was 13 years old, an absolute old man in dog years. His muzzle was completely gray, his joints were stiff, and he rarely barked anymore. He was my shadow. Every single night, Buster would curl up right next to my legs on my bed. It was a freezing, bitter night in mid-January. The wind was howling outside, rattling the old window panes. The living room downstairs still had the Christmas tree up, glowing faintly in the dark. Somewhere around 2:45 a.m., I woke up shivering. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold, it was the weight missing from my bed. Buster wasn't there. Thinking he just needed to go out to the yard to pee, I swung my legs out of bed, rubbed my eyes, and grabbed my phone for light. "Buster?" I called out, my voice raspy from sleep. No response. No sound of paws clicking on the hardwood floor. I walked down the creaking staircase into the pitch-black living room. The house felt suffocatingly quiet. I walked past the glowing Christmas tree toward the kitchen. At the far corner of the kitchen was the heavy wooden door that led down into the basement. It was a notoriously stubborn door, the latch was broken, so I always left it slightly ajar. As I stepped into the kitchen, my phone light caught Buster's silhouette. He was standing perfectly still in the darkness, his body tense, his nose pressed right against the gap of the open basement door. He was staring intensely down into the absolute blackness of the stairs. "Buster, what is it, buddy?" I whispered, walking up behind him. His tail gave a tiny, hesitant wag for a fraction of a second, and then it went completely rigid again. His ears were pinned back against his head. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stared into the void below. A cold shudder ran straight down my spine. There is nothing worse than your dog staring into a dark basement in the middle of the night. It sets off an primal alarm in your gut. I reached out, flicked the basement light switch, and the yellow bulb illuminated the wooden steps. Buster took one cautious step closer to the edge, but refused to go down. I looked down, but from that angle, you couldn't see the actual basement floor, only the first few steps. "Come on, boy. Let's go back upstairs," I muttered, suddenly feeling incredibly unwelcome in my own kitchen. I grabbed Buster by his collar, pulled him back, and slammed the basement door shut as hard as I could, jamming a heavy kitchen chair under the handle just in case. Back in my bedroom, I locked the door and pulled Buster onto the bed. But sleep was impossible. Every 3 to 4 minutes, I would feel the mattress vibrate. I'd open my eyes and see Buster sitting completely upright, his eyes locked onto my bedroom doorway. He was listening to something. Something that my human ears couldn't detect. The hair on the back of his neck was standing on end. By 4 a.m., the psychological pressure was too much. I told myself I needed to be a man. My dad wasn't here to protect this house, so I had to. I wasn't going to text my mom at 4 in the morning like a scared little kid. I grabbed a heavy aluminum baseball bat from my closet, crept out of my room, and walked back downstairs. Buster followed me, his paws stepping perfectly in my sink. When we reached the kitchen, my heart stopped. The heavy kitchen chair I had jammed under the basement door handle was moved. It was sitting 2 feet away from the door. And the basement door was wide open that I gripped the baseball bat until my knuckles turned white. Buster stood right at the threshold of the basement, staring down into the darkness again. Is someone down there?" I yelled into the black void, my voice cracking slightly. Silence. I flicked the light switch. The dim bulb buzzed to life. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first wooden step. Creak. The old wood groaned under my weight. I took a second step. The ceiling of the basement stairs was low, meaning you couldn't see the actual basement layout until you were halfway down. I reached the third step when a sound sliced through the cold air. It was a voice. Coming from the deepest, darkest corner of the basement, right behind the old laundry room door. "Ethan, help me." My heart literally dropped into my stomach. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that voice instantly. It was a voice I hadn't heard in over 3 years. It was Uncle David. But it didn't sound right. It sounded weak, strained, and hollow, like he was speaking through a layer of dirt or water. Adrenaline exploded through my veins. Disbelief and panic blinded my judgment. "Uncle David?" I screamed, throwing all caution out the window. I sprinted down the remaining steps, swinging the bat wildly, expecting to find my long-lost uncle bleeding or hurt on the concrete floor. I hit the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The basement was completely empty. The old dusty couch, the broken TV stand, the storage boxes, everything was exactly where it always was. There was no one there. I turned around. Buster was still sitting at the very top of the stairs. He refused to set a single paw in the basement. He was looking down at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Uncle David?" I called out again, my voice trembling violently now. My heart was pounding at 120 beats per minute. I cautiously checked behind the couch. Nothing. I checked behind the furnace. Nothing. The only place left was the small, isolated laundry room in the far corner. The door was slightly ajar. As I approached it, I stopped. I held my breath. From the other side of that laundry room door, I heard the faintest, wet, scraping sound. Like fingernails dragging against concrete. And then, a low, distorted chuckle that sounded absolutely nothing like a human being. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror hit my entire body. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get out. I turned around and sprinted up those basement stairs like a terrified child. I didn't even bother turning off the light. I slammed the basement door shut, and for the first time in months, old Buster let out a series of frantic, loud, piercing barks. He turned and raced up to my bedroom ahead of me. We flew into my bedroom, I locked the door, threw my body against it, and grabbed my phone with shaking hands. I dialed my mom. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, she picked up, her voice groggy. "Ethan? What's wrong? It's 4 in the morning. Mom. Someone is in the basement." I screamed into the receiver, tears of absolute terror stinging my eyes. "I heard him, Mom. It's Uncle David. He's downstairs in the laundry room, he called my name. You lied to me, he's here. I expected her to panic, to gasp, or to tell me she was calling the police. Instead, the phone went dead silent. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't groggy anymore. It was chillingly calm. Ethan, listen to me very carefully. You must have had a nightmare. No. Buster heard it too. Buster is barking his head off. I am telling you, Uncle David is downstairs. My mom took a deep, shaky breath on the other end of the line. I could hear her start to cry quietly. Ethan. I didn't tell you the truth because you had already lost your father, and I couldn't bear to break your heart again. Uncle David didn't move away. 3 years ago, he was diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 lung cancer. He passed away in the hospital within a month. I buried him, Ethan. Uncle David is dead. The blood completely drained from my face. My phone almost slipped from my hand. Then who is in my basement? I whispered, looking at Buster, who was still growling at my bedroom door. My mom's tone completely changed into pure panic. Ethan, if someone is in that house, you need to hang up and call 911 right now. Lock your door and don't move. I hung up and immediately dialed 911. Within 10 minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled into my driveway, their red and blue lights flashing through my bedroom window. I ran downstairs, unlocked the front door, and let the 2 officers in. I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. I pointed straight toward the kitchen. The basement, they're in the laundry room. The officers drew their firearms and moved into the kitchen. I insisted on following them, gripping my baseball bat. They pushed the basement door open and moved down the stairs, their heavy flashlights cutting through the dim yellow light. They reached the laundry room. One officer gripped the handle, counted to 3, and kicked the door wide open, flipping the light switch. The room was completely empty. The washing machine and dryer were sitting there covered in dust. No secret doors. No open windows. No one hiding behind the appliances. It was completely void of life. The officers searched the rest of the house, the first floor, the closets, the attic. Nothing. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, clearly thinking I was a 19-year-old kid who had taken too many drugs or had a severe panic attack. They told me to lock up and left. After they left, I sat on my bed, holding Buster close to my chest. I didn't sleep a single second that night. For the next week, that house was absolute hell. I couldn't step foot in the kitchen after dark. Buster refused to go anywhere near that basement door again. I know what I heard wasn't a hallucination. If it had just been me, I could have blamed my grieving mind. But Buster reacted first. Buster woke me up. Whatever was down in that basement that night, it knew my history. It knew who I missed. And it used Uncle David's voice to try and lure me down into the dark. My mom put the house on the market the very next week. It sold within a month. I never looked back, but to this day, whenever I stay in a house with a basement, I make sure that door is locked from the outside. Because you never know what's waiting at the bottom of the stairs, practicing the voices of the people you love. They say that when a house is empty, it slowly begins to die. The wood warps, the walls crack, and the silence becomes deafening. But what if the empty space beneath your feet isn't dead at all? What if something is alive down there, moving in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to let you know you are never truly alone? It happened when I was 24. I had just moved across the country to Georgia for a new job opportunities and was looking for a cheap place to live. I ended up renting the top floor of a massive, century-old Victorian house. It wasn't a standard apartment complex. Instead, the original owner had converted the second floor into a self-contained living space decades ago. It had a small kitchen, a living room, a bathroom, and a bedroom that overlooked the overgrown backyard. The landlord was an older man who lived thousands of miles away in California, so I almost never saw him. The ground floor of the house was completely vacant. The landlord told me he was planning to renovate the lower level before leasing it out to new tenants, but because of budget issues, the project was indefinitely delayed. At first, I didn't think much of it. The rent was incredibly low, and having no neighbors downstairs meant I could have absolute peace and quiet. But after a few days, the reality of the situation started to sink in. Every single evening, as dusk turned into night, I realized I was sleeping directly above a completely dark, hollow, and vacant labyrinth. The first couple of weeks passed without any major incidents. I spent my evenings catching up on work, watching movies, and scrolling through my phone in bed. Then, one particularly stormy night, everything changed. The wind was pushing heavy rain against my bedroom window. I was lying in bed, just about to drift off to sleep, when I heard a sound that made my entire body freeze. Thump. It was a single, heavy sound, and it came from directly below my bed, through the floorboards. I sat up, holding my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Old houses are notorious for making strange noises. They creak when the temperature drops, the pipes groan when the water runs, and the wood pops as the structure settles. But this didn't sound like wood or metal. It had a heavy, organic density to it. It sounded exactly like the heel of a heavy shoe pressing firmly onto the hardwood floor of the vacant apartment downstairs. I waited for a few minutes, staring at the floorboards, but the sound didn't repeat. I tried to convince myself that a tree branch must have struck the outside wall of the house. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The following morning, on my way out to work, I decided to check the ground floor. The main entrance to the downstairs apartment was located right next to the stairs leading up to my place. I walked up to the heavy wooden door and turned the brass knob. It was locked tight. I peeked through the dusty front window. The interior was completely stripped of life. There was no furniture, no carpets, and no curtains. The historical crown moldings were covered in cobwebs, and a thick layer of dust rested on the floor. The only item in the entire living room was an old, broken wooden table left in the center of the room. It looked utterly abandoned. I felt a bit foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me, so I went to work and tried to forget about it. But the peace didn't last long. A couple of nights later, the sounds returned, and this time, they weren't accidental. That I was standing in my small kitchen, washing dishes, when the sound started again. Step, step, step. It was a slow, deliberate cadence. Whoever, or whatever, was downstairs was walking across the empty living room directly underneath my feet. The footsteps were measured, as if someone was pacing back and forth, examining the empty walls. I turned off the kitchen faucet. The sudden silence in my apartment made the sounds from downstairs even louder. I walked into my living room, stood perfectly still in the center of the rug, and listened. Step, step, creak. The footsteps moved from the living room toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. I could literally trace the movement through the vibrations in my floor. It was impossible for this to be an animal. Raccoons or rodents scurry rapidly, they don't walk with the heavy, balanced weight of a full-grown human being. Terrified, I messaged my friend, Marcus, who lived a few blocks away. I told him I kept hearing phantom footsteps from the abandoned unit downstairs. Marcus, being the practical guy he is, tried to laugh it off. He sent back a message saying, maybe your landlord finally hired some ghosts to finish the renovations. I tried to laugh, but my stomach was tied in knots. Over the next week, the house became a psychological trap. The footsteps became a regular occurrence. Sometimes they would last for just a minute or two, and then absolute silence would follow. But one night, the activity escalated to something far more terrifying than just steps. I was reading a book on the couch when I heard a sharp, echoing slam from below. It sounded exactly like a wooden cabinet door being forcefully shut. That was the breaking point. Someone was definitely inside that apartment. I immediately dialed my landlord in California. When he answered, he sounded more annoyed by the long-distance call than concerned about the security of his property. There's no way anyone is in there, the landlord said defensively. The keys are with me, and the local real estate office hasn't shown the property to anyone. Old Victorian homes have strange acoustics, kid. The sound of the wind or the traffic outside can bounce through the walls and sound like it's coming from inside. But I heard a cabinet slam, I protested, my voice trembling. Look, if you're really that paranoid, call the local police, he sighed. But I'm telling you, the place is secure. His dismissive attitude left me feeling completely isolated. I realized that if something went wrong, I was entirely on my own. A few days later, I came home incredibly tired after a long shift at work. The night was pitch black, and the old streetlights outside cast long, eerie shadows through my windows. The moment I unlocked my door and stepped into my upstairs apartment, the air felt different. It felt heavy, thick, and charged with tension. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood near the entryway, listening. Everything was deadly quiet. Then, right below my bedroom, a massive thud echoed through the house. It sounded like someone had violently bumped into the wall or knocked over a heavy object downstairs. Panic seized me. I backed up so quickly that my heel caught on the edge of the hallway rug, and I nearly lost my balance. I stood in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring down at the floorboards as if my eyes could penetrate the wood. Then came the footsteps again. But they weren't pacing this time. They were moving rapidly, heading straight toward the area directly beneath where I was standing. I didn't wait. I grabbed my car keys from the counter, ran out of my apartment, flew down the stairs, and locked myself inside my sedan parked in the driveway. Sitting in the safety of my locked car, I finally called the local sheriff's department. 2 deputies arrived within 15 minutes. They checked the exterior of the house with their heavy tactical flashlights, looking for broken windows or forced entry. Then, they used a master key tool to unlock the main ground floor door. I stood near the porch, watching them enter the dark void. I could see the beams of their flashlights cutting through the dust inside. After about 10 minutes, both deputies walked back out, shaking their heads. "The place is entirely clear," the older deputy said, shining his light toward the ground. "There are no signs of anyone breaking in, all the windows are latched from the inside, and there's no one hiding in the closets. It's just an old, drafty house, son. When the wind catches the chimney, it creates a vacuum that can cause doors to rattle." They were polite, but their expression said everything. They thought I was a paranoid city kid who couldn't handle the noises of an old southern home. They drove away, leaving me alone in the driveway. I went back upstairs, feeling deeply embarrassed. I told myself the police were right. I was letting my anxiety get the better of me. I changed into my clothes, turned off all the lights, and crawled into bed, forcing myself to close my eyes. The house went dead silent for a long time. Then, the footsteps started again. But this time, they didn't pace. They walked slowly into the room directly beneath my bedroom and stopped. Whoever it was, they were now standing in the exact same spot where my bed was positioned upstairs, separated only by a layer of old wood and plaster. I held my breath, terrified to make even the slightest movement that might betray my presence. Tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat. The sound didn't come from the floorboards. It came from underneath the floorboards. Someone was standing downstairs, reaching up, and physically tapping on the ceiling of the ground floor, right below my mattress. 3 sharp, deliberate taps. Then silence. The sheer psychological terror of that moment was indescribable. It felt like a direct message. They were letting me know that they knew exactly where I was lying. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and sent a desperate text to Marcus. "Can I sleep on your couch? I'm leaving right now." As I waited for his reply, the sound returned. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't even bother to grab a jacket or change my clothes. I threw the blanket aside, bolted out of my bedroom, sprinted down the stairs, and drove straight to Marcus's house. I stayed there for the remainder of the night, refusing to close my eyes. The next afternoon, Marcus accompanied me back to the apartment. I refused to enter the house alone. We decided to do our own thorough inspection of the perimeter. We walked around to the dense, overgrown backyard where the old oak trees blocked the sunlight. Marcus walked up to a small, isolated cellar window that led to the utility room of the ground floor apartment. He crouched down, cleared away some dead leaves, and gasped. "Hey, look at this," Marcus whispered, pointing his flashlight at the window frame. The window looked closed from a distance, but upon closer inspection, the old iron latch had been completely sawed off. The wooden frame was loose. Marcus reached out and easily pushed the window upward. It slid open smoothly, revealing a dark opening just wide enough for a lean person to crawl through. And right there on the dusty concrete sill inside the window were fresh, deep scuff marks from a pair of sneakers. The blood drained from my face. It was real. Someone had been sneaking into the empty ground floor apartment through this hidden window, using the abandoned space as a shelter, and tracking my movements from below. That I called the landlord immediately and told him about the broken cellar window and the footprints. He finally took me seriously and promised to hire a local handyman to bolt the window shut. But mentally, I was already done. I couldn't spend another night in that house knowing someone had been standing in the dark, watching my ceiling, listening to me sleep. That same evening, Marcus helped me load my most valuable belongings, my electronics, clothes, and documents, into my car. We were working quickly, trying to get out before darkness fully set in. Marcus took a heavy box down to the car, leaving me alone upstairs to pack my laptop and chargers in the living room. As I was stuffing the cables into my backpack, the house fell into a sudden, deep silence. And then, from the open stairwell that led downstairs, a sound echoed upward. A heavy, raspy cough. It was a deep, distinctly human cough, followed by the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the shadows of the ground floor hallway. A wave of pure adrenaline hit my body. I didn't say a word. I grabbed my backpack, flew down those stairs like a bullet, and slammed the front door behind me. I scrambled into my car, locked the doors, and drove away from that Victorian house, leaving half of my furniture behind. I broke my lease that very week, and the landlord didn't even argue. To this day, whenever I visit a new place or stay in a multi-story building, I can't help but stare at the floorboards beneath my feet, wondering if the space below is truly empty, or if someone is standing down there, listening to the sound of my steps. We invite smart devices into our homes to make our lives easier. We give them microphones, we let them listen to our voices, and we trust them to obey our commands. But have you ever wondered what happens when your smart speaker responds to a voice that didn't come from you? What if it's listening to someone standing right behind you in the dark, whispering commands you were never meant to hear? My name is Chris, and this happened when I was 22 years old. I was living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in New Jersey, sharing a unique, mother-daughter, style house with my older brother, Austin. The house was split into two separate living spaces. Austin lived in the renovated lower apartment which had its own private entrance, while I occupied the entire upper floor. My area upstairs was a beautiful, wide-open space. The front door opened directly into a large living room that flowed seamlessly into a modern kitchen and dining area. A long, narrow hallway extended from the kitchen, leading past a guest bathroom, a spare room I used as a walk-in closet, and finally ending at my master bedroom. Austin and I had an interior wooden door that connected our two apartments, but we usually kept it locked to maintain our privacy. It was a perfect arrangement. We had our own independent lives, but we were close enough to help each other if needed. The week this happened, Austin and his fiancée left for a long-planned vacation to a beach resort in Mexico. Since our parents owned the property and there were no other tenants, I suddenly had the entire two-story house completely to myself. The first night started out completely ordinary. I got home from my job around dusk, threw some comfortable clothes on, and turned on the TV in the living room for some background noise. I walked into the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner, chicken, rice, and broccoli. As I was standing over the stove, stirring the rice, a sudden, heavy sound echoed from downstairs. It sounded like something solid hitting the drywall or a heavy piece of furniture shifting on the floorboards below. I stopped stirring and listened intently. The downstairs apartment had been completely dark and empty for 3 days. I reasoned that it was just the house settling, or perhaps a heavy book had slid off one of Austin's shelves. To be safe, I wiped my hands, unlocked the connecting door, and walked downstairs. I flipped on the lights and inspected every single room, Austin's living room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom. Everything was locked, secure, and exactly how he had left it. I went back upstairs, relocked the door, finished my dinner, and eventually went to bed. I was fast asleep when a sudden blast of music jolted me awake. My heart was pounding as I sat up in bed, trying to orient myself in the darkness. The sound was coming from the kitchen. It was my Amazon Echo smart speaker, and it was blasting a slow, dark, instrumental melody that I had never heard before. It had an incredibly eerie vibe, filled with heavy violin strings that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Alexa, stop!" I yelled from my bed, assuming it was just a strange digital glitch or an automatic software update gone wrong. The music kept playing, echoing down the long hallway. I got out of bed, walked to my bedroom doorway, and raised my voice louder. "Alexa, stop!" This time, the blue light on the device flashed, and the music instantly cut off. The apartment fell back into a deep, heavy silence. I stared at the device on the kitchen counter for a moment, shook my head at the unreliability of modern technology, and walked back to bed. But just as I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and closed my eyes, the speaker's digital voice broke the silence from the kitchen. "I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. I am having trouble understanding right now." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The apartment was completely empty. Why was it trying to process a command? Angered and slightly unsettled, I walked back out to the kitchen, reached behind the device, and forcefully yanked the power cord out of the wall. "There," I thought, "now you can't play anything." I went back to my room and fell asleep quickly. Hours later, I woke up frozen. The same dark, heavy instrumental music was blasting through the apartment again. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't process reality. I was half asleep, but the sheer terror of realization hit me like a wave of ice water. I had physically unplugged that speaker. I remembered the texture of the plastic wire in my hand. There was absolutely no logical way it should have power. I stepped into the hallway, my body trembling with a primal fear. I slowly walked toward the kitchen. The blue ring on top of the Echo speaker was spinning in the dark, illuminating the granite counter. "Alexa, stop," I whispered, my voice cracked with fear. The music ceased instantly. I stepped closer and shined my phone's flashlight onto the outlet. The power cord was plugged firmly back into the wall socket. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a wave of nausea hit my stomach. Unless I had sleepwalked, navigated a dark hallway, and perfectly plugged a tiny wire into a wall socket without remembering it, someone else was in this apartment. Someone had stood over my kitchen counter in the dark and plugged the device back in. Terrified, I backed away into my bedroom and locked the door. Thank God my bedroom door had a heavy, sturdy deadbolt lock. I dragged a heavy wooden chair over and jammed it under the doorknob for extra security. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so violently I could barely type. I messaged Austin on WhatsApp. "Austin, are you home? Are you playing a joke on me? Please tell me you're home." As I stared at the screen, waiting for a reply, I noticed the status at the top of our chat window under his profile picture. His live location tag clearly read, Playa del Carmen, Mexico. My heart sank. This wasn't a prank. This was a living nightmare. I sat on the edge of my bed, pressing my ear against the wood of my bedroom door, listening to the vast, dark emptiness of the living room and kitchen outside. 10 minutes of absolute, agonizing silence passed. I could hear the wind howling outside and the sound of my own frantic breathing. Then, through the gap at the bottom of my bedroom door, a sound carried down the long hallway. It was a whisper. It was incredibly quiet, raspy, and low, but because the apartment was dead silent, every single syllable was terrifyingly clear. "Alexa, play." My entire body went completely numb. Every ounce of warmth drained from my skin. It was a human voice. It was deep, completely unfamiliar, and it was standing right over the kitchen counter. Before I could even process the horror, the smart speaker responded with its cheerful digital chime, and the loud, booming instrumental music started blasting through the house once again, rattling the walls. Pure panic took over. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I didn't care about catching the intruder. I just wanted them to know I was armed and dangerous. I grabbed a heavy iron golf club from my closet, dialed 911 on my phone, and started screaming at the top of my lungs through the locked door. "I am calling the police. I have a weapon. Get out of my house. The cops are on their way." I was 22, terrified, and trapped in my own room. The operator answered, and I frantically whisper-screamed my address into the phone, telling her that an intruder was in my kitchen, manipulating my smart devices. The music was blasting so loudly that I couldn't hear if the person was approaching my bedroom door or running out the front entrance. "Alexa, stop." I screamed again from inside my room. The music cut off. The sudden silence was deafening. I waited, holding the golf club raised over my shoulder, staring at the doorknob, expecting it to shake at any second. 6 minutes later, loud, heavy thuds rattled the front door downstairs, followed by the shouting of the local police officers. "Police department. Open up." I ran to my window, saw the flashing blue lights in the driveway, and yelled out that I was upstairs. I removed the chair, unlocked my door, and ran down the hallway to let them in. 2 officers entered with their firearms drawn. They swept the upstairs living room, kitchen, and closets. Then, they unlocked the interior door and searched Austin's entire lower apartment. After a thorough 10-minute search, the officers returned to the kitchen. "There's no one in the house, son," the primary officer said, putting his notepad away. "But when we arrived, your main front door upstairs was wide open. It was unlatched and swinging in the wind. I locked that door before I went to bed," I insisted, tears of frustration in my eyes. "Someone came in here. They plugged my speaker back in. I heard them whisper to it." The officers looked around the kitchen. There were no signs of a struggle, and nothing valuable like my TV or laptop had been stolen. They assumed an intruder had walked in through an unlocked door, messed with the speaker to terrify me, and bolted out the front door the moment I started screaming about 911. They advised me to change the locks and left a cruiser parked down the street for the rest of the night. I stayed at a friend's apartment for the next 2 days until Austin returned from Mexico. When he got back, I met him at the house and explained every single detail. Austin believed me because I showed him the official police report, but we couldn't figure out how anyone had entered without breaking a window. We spent the afternoon installing high-definition security cameras at both the front and back doors. It was only when Austin went downstairs to unpack his vacation bags that the final, chilling puzzle piece fell into place. He called me downstairs, his voice sounding completely hollow. I walked into his apartment and found him standing in his utility closet, pointing at the floor. There was a small, square maintenance hatch in the floor that led into the crawlspace beneath the house's foundation. The wooden cover had been pushed open from the inside. Next to the hatch lay an old sleeping bag, a few empty water bottles, and a small handheld flashlight. Whoever it was hadn't broken into my apartment that night. They had been living in the dark crawlspace underneath Austin's floorboards for weeks. And that first night, when I heard that heavy thud from downstairs while Austin was away, it wasn't the house settling. It was the intruder, finally coming up out of the ground, unlocking the interior doors, and walking up the stairs to stand over my counter in the dark. We sold that house 6 months later. To this day, I don't use smart speakers or voice-activated devices in my home. Because every time I see a device light up, listening to the ambient noise of an empty room, I am reminded of that raspy whisper in the dark, commanding the house to play.